Monta Lee Dakin has worked in a variety of museums for over 40 years. She was executive director of the Mountain Plains Museums Association and of Colorado Preservation, Inc., a statewide historic preservation organization where she established Colorado's most endangered places list. Her museum jobs include working at the Smithsonian Institution, Mount Vernon, Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Gadsby's Tavern Museum in Alexandria, Virginia. At all these museums, she worked with collections, event planning, and museum management, including long range planning. She now provides planning, object identification, and other consulting services to small and museum sized museums. So, welcome, Monta Lee, to our conference. We're excited to have you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And it's been a lot of fun to see familiar faces and new faces over the past 2 days. So thanks for inviting me, and looking forward to seeing the last session after mine. Okay, so small museums, what do we do now? You know, this has been a dreadful year in so many ways. Museums were put through the ringer with the pandemic, where traditional models of operation were upended or are now in question. So today we'll take a look at how museums are doing 1 year later. And we'll do that through the lens of the chapter that Steve Friesen and I co-authored in the recently published book, Reimagining the Historic House Museum. He mentioned it in his talk this morning. That chapter is called Success Factors for Museums. It chronicles the factors that make small museums successful. In this chapter, we profiled successful museums and then identified what made them successful. Today, we'll take a look at how they're doing, how they weathered the pandemic, and if their success during normal times has been sustainable during COVID. My talk will be in 3 parts. The first will cover the impact the pandemic has had on museums and what changes we should expect from museums of all types and sizes. The second part will cover core values that sustain museums during times of disruption. And the third will cover what successful small museums did before and during the pandemic. Layered throughout will be trends that have popped up and may likely have staying power. I'll wrap things up by talking about where small museums go from here. And at the end, I'll take your questions, so don't feel free to post questions in the chat box. To start out, let's do a gut check on museums to see how they are doing 1 year after COVID hit us so hard. I don't think people will ever forget March of 2020 and how the world changed in a matter of 2 weeks. Today, as we look back to 1 year ago, the pandemic is almost unrecognizably different. A terrifying catastrophe has given way to a sense that maybe, just maybe, we are nearing the finish line. We no longer hear about the need to flatten the curve, and the exploding rate of vaccinations in every state has led to the opening of businesses, schools, travel, and yes, museums. Hello, Anna. So things have started to change, but we are not at the finish line yet. Scientists are saying, give it 2 more months before we actually see a change. Of course, we are all ready for that change. Let's hope the nightmare of last year will soon be behind us. During that nightmare, we learned many things. For example, we worked from home and for a year wore pants without buttons. New moms and dads got to spend extra weeks and months with their newborn, which was really good. And there were other good things. Some found they liked ordering groceries online, and we can now see that practices such as working remotely, board meetings on Zoom, and nonstop online shopping, I raised my hand on that one, will not completely vanish. They'll stay because they are more convenient. We added new words to our everyday lives, or at least words that people were not using on a regular basis, such as hybrid, I did a thing, and of course, Zoom. And what an impact the Zoom platform has had. It allowed us to meditate online, to do a Thanksgiving Zoom, to gather weekly with pals and family. Of course, we had to figure out how to use Zoom, which meant we've all been on this huge learning curve. So despite the tragedy, the deaths, and economic struggles, not every aspect of the pandemic has been terrible. There are even some who have determined that the old normal may not be worth it anymore, and that the pandemic has changed us. Indeed, many are saying we experienced two pandemics this year, the COVID one and the one in which racial inequity brought us to new levels of social consciousness. On the latter, the pandemic brought a heightened awareness to social issues that were a long time in the making, but could no longer be ignored or that we saw differently. Colleen Dillenschneider, who writes the blog Know Your Own Bone, calls what we went through a disruption. She said 2020 was a wake-up call for cultural entities to better prepare themselves for disruptive events. She also predicts that disruptive events will happen again and again. Well, thank you, Colleen. That's not what we really want to hear, is it? But when they do, organizations need to have structures and cultures in place to help them adapt and survive. Another thing that the pandemic has done is to show us how interconnected all human life is and how inequities that plague American society have affected everyone, even the most privileged. Regardless of the color of our skin, our ethnic background, our age, or our gender, we have all been affected. The good news is that from this turbulent point, systemic change that is good for all of us just might occur. Someday, this time may be considered as transformational as the late 1960s or even the 1920s. Remember what Steve said this earlier today about the roaring 20s and how it followed the flu pandemic of 1918 and became a time of rapid economic growth and structural transformation. Some believe this could happen to us in this 2020 decade. Of course, there is no instruction manual for how to live in a post-pandemic world. But if the Spanish flu of 1918 is any guide, there will be opportunities in the 2020s, but they may not yet be apparent. So how does this affect museums? According to museum consultant Susie Wilkeney, who conducts regular surveys of museums and collects data on all aspects of museum operations, she thinks a return to normal visitation is going to be a lengthy process, with museum audiences gradually increasing their in-person visits throughout 2021. At the same time, we need to be mindful of what the CDC warns us. We must still wear masks and socially distance since the virus continues to spread and now it's mutating, and numbers in some states are going up and not down. It is in this landscape of uncertainty that museums here and around the world are reopening or scaling back up. And museum leadership still must deal with safety protocols and capacity issues, while also addressing increasing calls for socially aware practices that continue to reverberate throughout the field. This call out for diversity, inclusion, equity, and access may very well be transforming for museums of all sizes. The acronym for this is DEAI and is all over social media and articles about museums. This is no longer just chatter among colleagues. More than ever before, museums are talking about how to make their museum more welcoming to visitors as well as to staff. The part about staff, that is the new piece. And they are putting all of this into actionable items to bring change to policies, practices, and priorities. This is about hiring practices as well as exhibit design to reflect themes of diversity and representation. These issues have been around for a long time. I remember when I first entered the museum field, everyone was talking about inclusivity and changing codes of ethics to reflect our desire for more diversity among staff and boards. But back then, while there was acknowledgement that diversity should happen and the desire was there to make it happen, it did not happen. One reason was because we didn't know how to make it happen. That's why today is different. Not only is the call for diversity and equity louder, but it also comes with a heightened awareness that now is the time. What all of this is really about, the real bottom line, is attaining greater excellence in what we do. It is about sharing. It is about how to navigate the present in order to stay relevant and emerge stronger in the future. And what will be important for our future? In keeping with national trends, it could look like the following. It's certainly about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, as we have already discovered or discussed. What's new is that this pertains to policy and staff. But what does this look like to the public? It will vary from museum to museum, of course, but there's no doubt that the public discourse over race and the underrepresented has moved inside our institutions. But this is not just about Black people and other minorities. It's much broader than that. It can be about employment practices and providing fair compensation. It's also about people who get overlooked. Take what Lonnie Bunch, who was the director of the Smithsonian, said about his work some years ago to transform the First Ladies Hall at the National Museum of American History. Too often in the past, the Smithsonian has celebrated women by what they wore rather than by what they accomplished. I redesigned the exhibition's most popular objects, the First Lady's dresses, to tell a more thoughtful and comprehensive story, such as how Eleanor Roosevelt championed social justice and fairness, and how Jackie Kennedy transformed public opinion of the White House. So Lonnie did not change the museum's most popular exhibit, he just tweaked it. And that made a huge difference in the story told about these women. The exhibit was much more interesting. Remember, what this is all about is excellence. The second thing that would be part of our future is connecting digitally. The reality of social isolation that we have just experienced spurred more people to be comfortable engaging online. And museum staff got very creative with developing experiences that provided access to the museum at a time when visitation was not possible. The extra effort expended toward digital strategy paid off, and it did not break the budget, but it did increase access to the museum. More than ever before, museums are being welcomed into people's homes where they can visit from their couch or their wheelchair, all because of a new technological tool. So access is not only about racial equality, but also about the disabled or the elderly. Think about the nursing home in your community and how you might reach out to its residents in new and different ways. You may be surprised at how digitally connected they are. The past year also saw an increase in collaboration between institutions. Cultural organizations had to make sense of how to reopen after the shutdown, and this led to a spirit of community and collaboration that continues. Finally, the future will be about adaptation. We all know that museums have been adapting to the world around them for decades. Now museums need to lean into continual adaptation to ensure that they remain relevant to the audiences and vital to their communities. So as museums emerge from this pandemic hibernation, what did not happen? Museums did not close, and they were expected to. Indeed, the rate of closure for museums was expected to be as high as 30%. To be sure, museums closed their doors when COVID spiked in their state or community. But for the most part, these were temporary closures, and we hope it stays that way. What all of these things showed us is that over the past year, museums survived. Indeed, they not only survived, but they triumphed by showing a resiliency to survive. They did this by remaining relevant to the audiences and to their community. So how did small museums maintain relevancy during the past year? They did what museums do best: sharing information, engaging the community, communicating more, innovating, and showing how resilient they can be when a crisis hits. In a way, the pandemic did something good for museums. It gave them a compelling reason to show off their institution in new and creative ways. But let's not kid anyone, it has been 10 times the work for half the money. And that recognition leads to this question about museums. Do current assumptions about what makes a small museum successful still hold? Well, let's find out. We'll start by going through the success factors that have helped museums thrive in normal times. What we are looking at here in this image is the order of success factors that appeared in the chapter that Steve and I wrote in the book that I had mentioned earlier. All of these success factors that you see in this image apply to museums in the pre-pandemic time and also post-pandemic. So these factors are still important, and each one is equal in their importance. For example, a museum must have a mission. This guides its activities and establishes a sense of stability. The mission also reveals a museum's uniqueness and how it is distinguished from other museums. That is why it is number one on the list. A museum also must have leadership to ensure that the mission is a good fit and the museum is following it. Leadership comes from the museum's director and the board. Strong leadership is especially essential when a site is confronted with challenges. That's why it's number two on the list. Next on the list is clear organizational structure. It is important that the way in which a museum is organized is clear and easy to understand, especially to staff and volunteers. A museum operates much more smoothly when everybody knows what their role is and who they report to. Internet and digital technology is about messaging, communicating, and engaging with one's community. It also levels the playing field for smaller museums, allowing them to represent a profile online that is as aggressive and dynamic as that of a larger institution. Creativity and adaptation is next on the list. One of the things that jumped out at us when we were writing the chapter on museums was that successful organizations are exceptionally adaptive, modifying their tactics to increase their success. Along the way, they've made mistakes and maybe have produced a flop or two, but they have mastered the ability to listen, learn, and modify their approach to fix problems and to stay relevant. Successful museums, particularly small museums, are masters at adaptation because they've had to become more creative to overcome dwindling in attendance and income. Evaluation. An organization that has a willingness to try and even fail at new programs must engage in self-examination to discover what works and what does not work. That makes evaluation an important component to a museum's success. Collaboration and collegiality are closely related to community engagement. And let's be frank here, there is always some degree of competition between museums, whether it be for donor support, admissions, or community recognition. Yet collaboration is generally good for all participants, whether they compete or not. Collegiality offers access to a network of colleagues for advice, support, and professional encouragement. Professional groups like MPMA and NMA can be vital to small museums that have few resources or are located in isolated communities and don't have ready access to a network of colleagues. In our years in the museum business, Steve and I found that those museums that take advantage of these collegial networks thrive, and those who do not, they often struggle. Despite the fact that we don't yet know what lies ahead for the museum field in a post-pandemic time, these factors of success are still important, and they can be helpful for the next disruptive period that Dylan Schneider has warned us about. And when the next crisis happens, perhaps the emphasis on these success factors may need to change. The success factors themselves are good and remain as core values for successful museums, but during a crisis, maybe the emphasis of the success factors should be changed and be based on the situation of the moment rather than on long-term structure. So what do I mean by that? The structure that you have as you enter a period of crisis is what you will have to work with during that crisis. So you want to make sure that the structure that drives your museum is intact and strong. That is because to make structural changes to one's policies or plan requires time and money. Think mission statement or strategic planning. Both of these take lots of time, and they should, as they are tools for an organization to make major changes. But during a crisis, there is neither time nor money for major changes. During a crisis, staff time is better spent on preventing a situation from getting out of hand. In other words, in a crisis, you are dealing with the headwinds hitting your museum. Since you have to make sure those headwinds don't rip off your shutters, this is no time to be discussing changing the color of those shutters. With that in mind, let us reorder the success factors to reflect how they can best serve a museum during a time of crisis. And let's widen the view to move beyond this pandemic to any kind of disruption that could occur in the future. I've put these lists side by side. Having a museum buffeted by a seemingly endless pandemic, which is not yet over, is incredibly challenging for museums of any size. So this clearly is not the time to change your mission. That is why it is at the bottom of the crisis list on the right. Yes, yet if you entered a crisis with a good and solid mission, then your museum is more likely to get through this period intact. Now let's move on to leadership. If you have strong leadership, then your museum will probably survive a major disruption, whether it is a pandemic or a major loss of funding. Whatever that future disruption might be, this is why leadership is now in the #1 position on our list of success factors in a crisis. Strong leadership is essential when a state is confronted with challenges. The savvy leader sees where new opportunities lie and then pivots quickly to implement them. This requires clear and decisive thinking and an ability to mobilize staff. Let's move to the next item, which is the internet at #2 on the crisis list. This past year, while employees were sheltering in place at home and wondering if they would still have a job, they started to look for new forms of engagement and collaboration. They were compelled by a situation no one could have predicted. So their priorities shifted to how they could better reflect and engage the communities. Directors, educators, collection managers, and anyone else working for the museum focused on sustaining engagement and increased their work productivity to pull this off. And what was the result? A massive use of the internet and digital platforms. That is why the internet and digital technology is #2 on our success list during a crisis. When museums had to shut down, everything was canceled. So being highly creative people, museum staff pushed their talents to the max and took their content viral. They figured this out quickly and pivoted immediately to online content. It was absolutely remarkable. And when museum staff did not know how to do something, they plowed onward anyway and figured out how to do it. The poster child for this phenomenon? Cowboy Tim. Remember him? Steve mentioned him this morning, but he is still the director of services at the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. He was the only staff person remaining in the museum when it closed, had never done social media before, but took it on and charmed the pants off of the museum's followers. He used his cell phone, so no funding was needed. He just did it. What Tim did was what others were doing, featuring his museum, and he showed it off. That is why investing in digital technology is becoming a must for museums. And doing this does not require buckets of money. Remember, Tim used his cell phone and now has hundreds of people on his Instagram account. And even though the museum has reopened, he is still doing this. That is an example of community engagement at no cost. What Tim and others did was adapting to a crisis. And that is why creativity and adaptation is #3 on our success list in a crisis. Sharing the museum virtually allowed museums to grant more access to a wider group of people. Suddenly, people were seeing a museum's collection in new ways and getting to know the museum staff like Tim. It was like a window into the museum had opened and everyone could peek inside to see what was going on. The community not only noticed, it loved it. And that's what brings us to the next factor on our crisis list: collaboration, collegiality, and engagement. All three are vital to the health of museums. As museums went virtual with both serious and fun stuff, we, the audience, began to see that museums were playing an important role in our lives during the shutdown. We were getting bored as we started looking for something else to do besides watching yet another Netflix film. Museums started to reach out to us to engage us by making us laugh and giving us something interesting to do and see. The remaining factors on this list, while at the bottom, will always continue to be important. But let's go on and talk about how, if a museum is successful, how will we know? What does successful look like? The clues or indicators of success are these that you see here on this slide. While it is true that a museum to be successful must be financially sustainable, the finances do not provide the only path to success. There are many other indicators to determine when a small museum has achieved some level of success. For example, satisfaction on the part of paid staff volunteers, and board members. Consistently dissatisfied personnel often indicate that serious problems exist. Conversely, happy staff can mean a thriving museum. Another factor is when leadership is visible. When museum leadership plays an active role in the community or with collegial associations, this is a sign that the museum is healthy enough to enable connections outside of its own walls. Consumer comments on TripAdvisor and Yelp can reveal much about an organization. And finally, physical maintenance. Deferred maintenance sometimes can reveal much about financial and institutional problems. Another point to be made about small museums is this. For some, small is exactly the size they need to be. To become bigger might not always be necessary for a museum to be considered successful. Growing larger in staff size, budget, or even programs should therefore not be a standard for evaluating success. Sometimes small institutions are stronger than larger institutions precisely because of their size. They may be more flexible and even have greater opportunities to be creative because they have a small staff that does many things rather than a large staff with singular duties. Now let's turn to those museums Steve and I identified as successful to see how they weathered this current storm. Every one of the museums that we profiled in our chapter is holding their own. None is shut down permanently, all have opened up, and all are busy preparing plans for summer and fall programming. So they survived the worst of the pandemic and are actively planning ahead for a post-pandemic world. So let's look at the number one item on our list of success factors in a crisis to see how leadership played a role in how these museums survived the past year. Hunter's Home in Oklahoma is typical in the way many museums opened up during the worst of the pandemic, but it did so with its own twist. Administrators of this Greek revival style house opened the grounds to visitors, but chose not to open the interior of the home. Because as they said on their website, the period furnishings might be ruined from the sanitizers. What this reflected was strong leadership. This is an example of strong leadership stepping in and saying, wait a minute, we can't do that in our museum, and we won't. One house in our profile of successful museums did not open at all during the height of the pandemic. And like Hunter's Home, this was by choice. The Hawes Lilienthal House, built in 1886 and the only Queen Anne style house museum in San Francisco, decided to stay closed to prevent the spread of the virus. Also, it did not have to open. Before the pandemic hit, major improvements were made to the structure of this architectural landmark, to its programming, and to the way the site is administered. But it was not always in good shape. Years before the pandemic, folks used to say the outlook for the museum was quite uncertain, and deferred maintenance was taking a toll. It took a while to turn things around, but it was leadership that made the difference. When the National Trust offered to add the museum to its National Treasures program, leadership pivoted quickly to take advantage of this collaboration. As a result, enough money rolled in to fully restore the building and create a rental unit that has added thousands of dollars to the budget each year. And doesn't it look glorious? Can't wait to see that. The Molly Brown House Museum, located in Denver, is another example of how some museums were in good shape when the pandemic hit. The work that museum staff did before the crisis, a capital campaign, new strategic plan, and a new mission, allowed them to put aside money so they didn't have to dip into the endowment fund to get through COVID. When COVID hit, one of the first things the Molly Brown staff did was to go through the budget and eliminate unnecessary expenditures. Since reserves were down and could not be readily replenished because the museum was closed during its high tourist season, staff began trimming expenses. But before they began cutting expenses, what the staff did was probably the most important thing to do at that moment. They paused and reflected on what was happening all around them and to consider new ways to do things. They looked at their organizational chart to see how to shake up staff and programming with the goal of coming out of the crisis as a leaner and better functioning museum. During COVID, staff revamped tours, carried out capital repairs, and beefed up the museum's digital communication. Leadership was behind all of these initiatives and was vital to how the museum responded to the crisis. Another important factor that helped this museum be successful was the ability to engage with the community. And sometimes this was challenging, especially when staff had to confront major problems. When do you tell someone you're in trouble, and when do you remain quiet? When the air conditioner broke during the hottest part of last summer, the director of the Molly Brown House wondered where they would get the $3,000 to buy a new one. And staff also worried about how honest and transparent they should be about their situation. Being desperate, they put out a plea to their members saying that staff wanted to come back to work, but it was just too hot to work without proper cooling. Almost immediately, members donated enough money to cover the cost. What this shows is a community that is fully engaged with this museum. And sometimes you just have to bluntly say, we need help. Another trend we saw during shutdown was the way in which museums connected with social media with their local community to let them know things were okay. Staff was able to show that things were still happening at the museum, even though the museum was closed. This was low budget, as postings were on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and images came from cell phones. Shadows on the Teche began doing this immediately when it shut down in March. Using its various social media platforms, staff communicated how, despite the complete loss of income during its busiest season, they were busier than ever before during this extended shutdown, using this time to work on numerous projects and addressing deferred maintenance. Then they listed what they were working on. Brilliant. A new tour, introductory exhibit, guide training, interpretive signage in the gardens, expanding the African American experience, and designing a new website. But staff didn't end there. They also revealed what was happening over at the nearby visitor center. It's been bustling inside and out. Crews are installing new shutters on the exterior of the building, and the facilities manager single-handedly painted the interior spaces. It was clear from this report that everyone was pitching in. But what was also clear was that this chatter was about mundane projects. Yet staff made it appear that this work was important. And I bet you dollars to donuts that their members and the local community loved reading all about these projects. Shadows on the Teche staff paired text with photos, just in case locals needed more evidence that staff really was doing the work that they claimed they were doing. They were showing their constituents that staff was working hard to take care of the museum and grounds. It was just as simple as that. And that is exactly what locals want to know, whether they say it out loud or not. This is where you can begin to build loyalty among your community. Twitter and Instagram are good platforms for daily notices about projects big and small, with photos and videos to match, of course. And so is Facebook. It depends upon where your constituents hang out. And wherever they are, this is where you should hang out too. That way they can find you and see what you're up to. In times of upheaval and change, the community needs assurance that everything is okay, but they also want to know what's going on during normal times. Undergirding all that makes museums successful is having a good mission to provide a vision for current and future work. One of the things that I have liked about Hunter's Home is its mission. A few years ago, staff took the time to review that mission. The result of this was not only changing the mission, but also changing the name of the site. This was major. Once they did all this, everything fell into place. Hunter's Home has now been restored to its right time period, one that relates to the history of the Cherokee Nation and the Trail of Tears. Its location in Tahlequah is where the Cherokee Nation is located, so it made sense to collaborate with them. Hunter's Home exemplifies what I've been saying about mission and collaboration. Museums that are true to their mission tend to be successful. In the case of Hunter's Home, it became successful once it found the right mission. Since we're on mission statements, let's talk about the new trend that is happening with these. It has long been said that a museum should do a better job of telling its visitors what is unique about it. Excuse me. This is because museums are often in competition with others in the community and too many times provide the same things to visitors. For instance, it seems that every historic house museum offers candle making and weaving. With this kind of repetition, no wonder attendance at those sites has declined. Mission statement should be the place where a museum's uniqueness shines. Yet for years, these statements have all sounded alike. How many of you still have a mission statement that says to preserve, to protect, and to educate? Well, maybe it's time to think about this differently. These days, the new trend is to find a mission or a purpose that is meaningful to your museum, one that can help visitors discern what is unique about your museum. Lincoln's Cottage, which was the equivalent of Camp David for Abraham Lincoln when he was president, has this as its mission statement: to reveal the true Lincoln and to continue his fight for freedom. Its vision statement, which describes how you will implement the vision of the mission, goes like this: to plant the seeds of Lincoln's brave ideas around the world so that all people everywhere can be free. Wow, what powerful statements these are. And they are powerful because they are packed with emotion. And this is the change that mission statements are going through. They now align with visitors who these days are in search of experiences. And if you saw the power in these statements like I did, we are not alone. The visitors are seeing this too. We are reacting to a mission that identifies the physical and spiritual elements that give meaning and value to a place. Another trend line that has come out of the pandemic is the way in which museums are embracing the underrepresented. This is what Lonnie Butch did with the First Ladies exhibit hall that I mentioned earlier. He tweaked it so that there was a more interesting story to be told about each of the First Ladies. Last August, Shadows on the Teche joined hundreds of organizations across the country to mark the centennial of the ratification of the 19th century amendment, which gave women the right to vote. It even illuminated the shadows in purple and gold, the official colors of the women's suffrage movement. The Molly Brown House also joined the celebration because its site has engaged heavily in women's rights. This makes sense, as it was the home of American activist and socialite Margaret Brown, also known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. She got this name after she survived the sinking of the Titanic and took up causes including women's suffrage. The museum's new theme of women's rights is therefore a natural for this organization. And the mission you see here in this slide is its new mission. These new mission statements are about engaging. And that brings us back to engagement as a success factor. It is by far one of the most important things a museum can do. The Stanton County Museum, located in western Kansas, engages its community by being a good neighbor. The Big Flag Project exemplifies this. The museum maintains the town's flag on the 90-foot tall flagpole at the north end of Main Street. It has an annual budget for this, $2,000, which ironically matches exactly the population of this small town. The town considers the museum's expenditure to be a big contribution because it shows that the museum values its community. The flags have to be replaced every year because of the high winds that whip through this farming town on the high plains. Unfortunately, the museum could not hold its annual fundraiser this year and started to run out of money to pay for the flags. When museum staff shared this predicament with the community, together they launched the Big Flag fundraiser. The community responded immediately to this plight because the townspeople understood what the museum does for its community. Katie Herrick is the director of this museum, and along with her staff, well, actually, she has two helpers and a very delightful husband. She's at work setting up a makerspace in the museum that will include an area for woodworking, sewing, computer technology, and the like. But there was still a need for a few more things like small weaving looms. So last week, Katie posted a plea on the museum's Facebook page asking for the two looms that you see in this image. And she added this comment: "We're trying to keep our costs down as we set up the makerspace." Clearly, Katie understands that her community likes to know that the local museum is spending its money wisely. The reason this story caught my eye is that Katie has figured out her community. She knows exactly what would interest the people who live there and the values they hold dear. So when does life turn to normal? No one knows, but we can see changes on the horizon. I like the way in which the director of the Molly Brown House put the future into perspective when I interviewed her recently. Andrea Malcolm was telling me how they had to lay off staff during the pandemic and how painful that was. The museum felt that it had built something amazing with its staff and programming, and now it was hard for them to see all of this rolled back. She ended by saying this, "At least we know how to get there again." Wise words. But make no mistake, this crisis has given museums a wake-up call, and it is a serious one. But help may be on the way. Here are a few things to know about. In the coming months, there may be new financial opportunities from government agencies like IMLS and statewide ones too, and due to the president's new jobs plan and infrastructure plan. The latter will include expanding broadband to rural America. This should be a big help to small museums that dot the rural landscape in every state, including Nebraska. There are also new programs rolling out for struggling museums. IMLS announced a new field-wide project to help small museums build capacity in technology and digital media at no cost. The Digital Empowerment Project is a collaborative effort of all 6 regional museum associations, and that includes MPMA. The Council of Regional Associations will oversee this project so that museums can do what museum leaders have been telling them to do in light of COVID: invest digitally. Not only will volunteers start coming back, but in the near term, there will likely be a renewed interest in a museum's permanent collection, especially the part of the collection that reflects the local community. And speaking of collections, are you collecting COVID-related materials for your museum's collection? I know Susan and Dawn have just talked about that, and so did others. Well, you might want to start doing this because in 100 years, people will be glad you did. So what do we know? And what do we do now, and where do we go from here? We have witnessed during the pandemic crisis the important role museums play as integral members of their communities. Whether focused on history, science, or art, museums put the past and the present into context. They do this better than any other cultural entity. No wonder polls show that museums rank among the most trusted institutions in the country. And that is where museums go from here, as we all lean into the future. Continue to be a good neighbor in your community, engage it with creativity, with an eye on new trends of opportunities. Open that window into your museum so we can get to know you better and your museum. And be the best you can be, because your community needs you. As a trusted neighbor, your museum may be the stabilizing force that helps your community rebuild its economy. Museums will survive the pandemic. It will take everything they have to do this. But remember, museums are adaptable, having survived this far with an impressive resiliency. This should not be a scary moment for museums, but rather a proud moment for the entire museum field. So thank you, and I'll stop my screen.
Thank you, Monta Lee. You had some really, really great information in your presentation. I like the ideas of really resiliency, and I think you're right that small museums, are already poised to be more resilient than the big museums that we all know.
Yeah, we love that over and over again.
Yes, my sister-in-law works for a large U.S. corporation, and she's talked about, anytime they, sort of want to change direction, it's like moving this huge cruise ship, like you have to make big changes that actually only make a small amount of difference. So.
And, having worked in small museums and other sizes, it took me a long time to realize that small museums really did have a leg up. And if I had known that when I was earlier in my career, oh boy, would I have had fun with that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure, many people, and I think that's maybe, good food for thought for just, most, virtually all museums in Nebraska are the small to mid-sized museums. So just, having that confidence. So.
Yeah, that's right. Confidence. I like that word, Kelly. And it is about confidence, knowing that you can fail because you're trying out new things and you want to find the thing that's going to work for your museum and your community.
Yep. Yeah. So people, if you have questions for Monta Lee, feel free to type them in the chat and I will ask her. Bonnie Newell said, excellent presentation. So, yes.
Thanks, honey. Well, I think just knowing that that we're surrounded by unknowns, that's been so trying on all of us. And it seems like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We keep hearing people say that, and we sure hope there is that light there.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. We have our first question that's come in. April White says, all of this is so encouraging. What are your opinions on borrowing? And she says, nicer word than stealing ideas from other institutions. Any thoughts on giving credit to those other places?
Yeah. Well, you do what you have to do and you do what you feel is right. But if it's in Timbuktu in New Jersey, why not just steal away? Steal away. I mean, that's why so many museums do candle making and weaving. They've all stolen from each other. But I think the other thing is you stay in touch with the museum field and all the different platforms, all the different articles, and you find out what people are doing. And if they're doing something interesting that seems like it could work for you, go with it. Take it and run with it.
Yeah, and we have a comment from Sydney Gnan, who's at the Joslyn Castle in Omaha. Thanks for all of the examples of other museums. The benchmarks are helpful.
Good. It's always good to hear the stories about what other museums are doing and how they have stumbled and had to pick themselves up and keep going. So it's good to know that that's out there because that's sometimes how we feel like we are doing is we keep stumbling and we wonder if anybody else is.
And both of our comments so far have come from people who work at museums that are in historic homes. So Joslyn Castle in Omaha, and then April White is at the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture at the University of Nebraska-Kearney.
Good. Well, historic house museums are so much, they have so much in common with just small museums that are not house museums.
Mm-hmm.
They really are similar. And I worked in both. And it's amazing how similar they are and how their solutions are similar, how their challenges are similar. And if you're in a small museum that's not a house museum, and you don't have somebody like the unsinkable Molly Brown when you're trying to figure out what your mission should be, then find out what your community is known for. Find out why that community established the museum. There are many ways to find out what is unique to your community. And one of the things to also consider is what is unique that your community will like. But then the flip side is, well, what's unique that will bring the people off the highway running by your community to your doors? So that could be two different things, but you should consider both. What will bring the visitors in and what will resonate with your community?
Yeah, thank you for those additional comments, Monta Lee. Those are good.
Sure.
Yeah, does anybody else have any additional questions for Monta Lee? Or comments, questions or comments? April said, wonderful, thank you.
And let me just throw something else out. This is following up on what I just said about whether you adapt, you throw the bone to your community or throw the bone to the tourists on I-80 or I-70. Steve did a consulting job with a museum that had a big hairball in its collection. And it was exhibited at the back of the museum. and they had brought him in to ask, what should we do to get more people to come in our door? And as soon as he saw that hairball, he said, oh my God, you not only should put that front and center, you should change your name to the Hairball Museum of the World. And he was right. That would have gotten people off the highway. But the community thought that was a terrible idea. So you never know.
Right. Yeah. And you have a comment from Scott Heath that says, excellent presentation. Oh, and Steve clarified, it was the world's largest hairball, exclamation point.
The world's largest, even better. And hi to you, Scott.
You. But then Bonnie says, where is it? We want to see it. So
well, it's in Kansas. You can Google it. It's like the ball of twine, but it's farther south.
Steve said last time he visited, they had it at their front desk.
Oh, they followed up on what Steve suggested. As consultants, you never know what, or even when you just make a suggestion to a colleague, you never know if they think it's stupid or will follow up on it, but apparently they did.
Sydney said they could sell replicas in the gift shop.
Well, you see, this is what is so interesting. You have interesting items in your collection. Every museum does. And you could pull it out and have fun with it and just, insert humor into it. And visitors like that. And that's what we were seeing during the pandemic when I was saying, they were showing us the serious stuff, but also the fun stuff. And they were making fun of their collections online. I thought that was the best. That was it was interesting. And you can do that even with just things on display.
Yeah, and Steve said it's in Garden City, Kansas. And then Scott Heath posted a link to the Atlas Obscura entry in the chat box there. So if anybody's interested in looking at it. And yes, I get, Monta Lee, and I think when I've been, to museums, in my travels, a lot of times, if they have some unique thing in their collection, if you sell it in the gift shop, people will buy it.
Oh, and I go to the gift shop first to see what's in that, what is special about that museum. And I'm never disappointed. I've never said, no, I should never do this again. It's a waste of time. Oh, nope, go to the gift shop. And if the gift shop is good, it will reflect the museum and its collections. And usually it does. The other thing that I might say is when you're trying to, maintain that global audience that you have, or you want to get a more global audience that you can do with virtual content, you go to places where you develop a Twitter feed and just join everybody, join all the museum stuff, museum people or the museums, and just broaden your own reach. And you start there, whether it be Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, just broaden your reach. And you can do that. It won't take very long. And all of a sudden you will be seeing things popping up. And then you can add to that Twitter feed or to the Facebook post and said, hey, we've got this program going on that you guys in France or you guys in Nova Scotia might be interested in. You could, it takes some doing, but you can expand your marketing just on those social media platforms.
Anna Nolan commented that she appreciated the photo of their museum, the Bone Creek Museum of Agrarian Art in David City, and she hopes that you can make a road trip to check them out.
Anna, I shared 2 of them, so I hope you saw the first one, and we can't wait to come back to David City. So thank you, Anna and Alan.
And Sydney has another question. He says, we have a terribly limited collection. The house is our artifact. Any ideas or similar museums come to mind?
Oh, yes. In fact, the Historic House Museum has been undergoing this whole shakeup, if you will. Actually, I've been a part of that. Donna Harris has a book out that's been out for about at least 10 years. It's the Bible and all the options available for a historic house museum, including turning it into a study center that is open only by appointment, or using it for discussion groups. Because if you don't have a lot of furniture in your house, then you can set up chairs and tables and have conversations. That's what the Harriet Beecher Stowe Museum is doing. They've taken out a lot of their period furnishings, probably the stuff that was not used by Harriet Beecher. And they have put tables and chairs in the middle of those of some of their period rooms, and they are having discourse on current issues. And people love being in their rooms, particularly those people from the community who have known those rooms furnished with ropes where they couldn't go in. Now they can go in, and they're having information discussions about the current issues, but also issues that were current during Harriet Beecher Stowe's time. So there's many ways to treat your historic house, particularly if you don't have many objects. The objects are becoming almost less consequential. I hate to see that because I'm an objects curator, but there comes a point where, you know, we have so many furnished historic houses. How many more do we need? What else can we do? How else can we be creative? And there are umpteen ways to be creative. So look at Donna Harris for her book. The National Trust has done a lot of work on updating historic house museums and bringing relevancy to them. And go to the Harriet Beecher Stowe website, and you can see what they are doing. Also, the Lincoln Cottage. I showed you Lincoln Cottage. Oh my God, that's a fabulous place. And those two sites are really doing creative things, much more so than any other place that I've seen recently.
I would say, to add to your comments, Monta Lee, years ago, I was at Iolani Palace in Honolulu. It's the only royal palace in the United States. And they have very, very limited furniture in that house. The furniture that's there was associated with the royal family. They don't have any extra things. And so when we were there, they had a campaign to find furniture or items, collection items that was related to the family. And so, you know, they were, you know, scour the internet themselves trying to find related items, but then also had a call out to people saying, if you find anything, let us know. We want to know about it. And, you know, think about either, you know, donating or, you know, they were willing to purchase, you know, items too. But it was really nice going through that house because there wasn't a lot of furniture. We got to go in all of these different rooms that in some historic house museums may have been roped off. So,
yeah. And, you know, France is way ahead of all of us in terms of what it does with its castles. Imagine trying to decorate those. But they have used technology to the best advantage, and also huge crowds. So there are ways. And by the way, I just saw that Steve posted in the chat box the link to Donna Harris's book. But yeah, you know, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have period furnishings in every room or in every historic house museum, because that house museum might be better known for its building, for its architecture. So why waste the time trying to find stuff if you really want to talk about the architecture of the time? I know that, Poplar Forest, which was Thomas Jefferson's summer home in Virginia. That's what they did. They didn't have any furnishings, and they just turned it into an architectural features that were highlighted with exhibits in each room. And these weren't massive exhibits. It was just like panels here and there. So that's the way they did it. And by the way, they have a great gift shop.
Yeah, and I know Sheldon Museum on the University of Nebraska Lincoln's campus, our office helped with the listing of the National Register a few years ago. And when they were celebrating their anniversary, they wanted to celebrate the fact that this is a Philip Johnson building. It's listed in the National Register, celebrating the anniversary. So they had a naked museum for a couple of months and took all of their exhibits down. And so the museum itself, the building, was the exhibit for several months. And so you could just go in and appreciate the architecture without feeling like, oh, well, I have to look at a bunch of art too, because no, the building is also the art.
You know, I knew the director at the time, and I saw what he did, and I just thought it was brilliant. And it was brilliant on a couple levels. First of all, he wanted to showcase the architecture, okay, but then he used the word naked.
Yes.
And it was like, wow, are you brave? And it made the New York Times.
Yep. Yeah, so we're almost out of time here, I think. Yes. But if anybody has any, final question or anything.
I was just going to say that all of these things that we've been talking about, it shows the creativity of museum staff. And that's why it's been such a joy to work in the field.
Yeah, Lynn just said, thanks for a great presentation in all caps and an exclamation point.
Thanks, Lynn.
So yeah, thank you very much, Monta Lee. It was a fantastic session. I really enjoyed it. So next, we were going to be taking a 15-minute break, and then we will be back at 3:30 for the times. They're always a changing. Tips for thriving through transitions with Lynn Ireland and Audrey Cotter. So make sure you are back and ready to go at 3:30. So thanks, everyone.